Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of Philosophy 320 Bioethics. This week, we are going to talk about the non-identity problem. I'm excited. I think it's an interesting problem. And it's interesting to think about because it comes up in a lot of contexts. Everything from slavery to native land, um, genocide, climate change, nuclear war, alien invasions, all kinds of things. So it's a non-identity problem is everywhere. We're going to apply it, we're going to think about it through the lenses of Tiny Tim and climate change, but hopefully you'll see the logic of it generalizes. All right, so let's hop in because this is a really cool topic. So the non-identity problem revolves around the obligations we have to individuals whose existence depends on our actions and where those actions appear to harm. So the obvious case would be something like climate change. Um, Depending on what we do for climate change, depending on how we act in climate change is going to affect uh, who is born in the future. So if you act on climate change or don't, that's going to have some impact on the people in the future. Because if you act on climate change, you may make the world less hostile to human existence, and thereby some people are going to meet others and have children with them. Whereas if you don't act on climate change, the world becomes more hostile. That's going to change certain events, and it's going to change who meets who. Um, Maybe think about your own parents, for example. Um, your parents could have easily married somebody else, had situations arisen differently, and had children with other people. Had their past gone differently, had major world events gone differently, had the outcome of wars gone differently. Um, this changes who is born in the future. So if we act to curb climate change, that's going to have an impact on who's born. And if we don't act, that's going to have a different impact on who's born. So that's sort of a very rough, quick and dirty sort of, you know, a very rough understanding what the identity problem is. It's actually more formal than that. So the identity problem is basically a problem of upholding three beliefs simultaneously and consistently. So there's basically three views that all look like they have something plausible going for them, but you can't hold them all together. So the identity problem is more of a paradox, but it has interesting implications for how we think about bioethics. So the first is the person affecting view in ethics. Um, this has to do with the fact that something is bad only if it's bad for somebody. It's weird to say that something is bad, but it's not bad for anybody in particular. It doesn't really affect them negatively. What does bad mean? So a lot of bioethicists and philosophers think that things are bad to the extent that they affect other people. Um, the second, or B, is bringing someone to existence whose life is worth living, um, but with a serious flaw isn't bad for that person. So suppose you bring someone into the world whose life is worth living overall, but they have some sort of disability or infirmary, something they're dealing with. And that isn't bad for that person. We're going to get into why that is. I'm just sort of stating the principle that's in conflict with the other principles. But the idea is that you're not doing anything wrong to that person. And we'll explain the logic of this in a second. And then finally, that some acts of bringing someone into existence are bad, even if they're not bad for someone, right? So the idea intuitively that something is not bad for anyone in particular, it's just something bad, you shouldn't do it. You can sort of see how that intuition would work. You know um, maybe rob a bank or you fire a gun into the air and it doesn't really affect anyone. So on the person affecting you, I think you didn't do anything wrong, but it's something you shouldn't have done. Firing guns into the air is probably not a good idea, despite the consequences. So it's bad. But I want to delve into each one of these and explain them. But first, I want to motivate this problem with an example. So this is Tiny Tim. I stole this example from The Christmas Carol. So Tiny Tim tells his parents they've harmed him by bringing him into existence with a disability. He has trouble walking on his own because of weak legs. Right, so he's got his crutch there to assist his walking. And you can see what Tim's complaint is here. It's, you brought me into existence with this disability, and it makes it challenging to walk. It makes my life more difficult. People that don't have this disability, don't face this challenge, have a much easier time of it walking. So And Tiny Tim didn't ask to be born. You might think like he's born and it's not really his fault. He didn't ask to be born with a disability. So you can think, well, in a sense, I can see his point. I can see the worry. Now, his parents respond that they haven't harmed him actually. His disability is genetic, and he couldn't have been born without weak legs. There's just something about um, when the sperm met the egg, it created a fetus with this genetic that became Tiny Tim, with this genetic defect towards weak legs. So um, their choices basically are either that Tiny Tim is born with a disability, given it's built in his genetic code, and we're assuming this isn't like an advanced society with like science fiction technology, and you can sort of go in and edit the gene before the kid's born. So we're assuming that like Tiny Tim's either has to be born with a disability because it's in his genetic code, or he isn't born at all, right? Because you just they don't give birth to him. Maybe they abort him. Maybe he's just the sperm never meets the egg. Whatever it is, like there's no other options here. Tiny Tim is either born with a disability or not born at all. So since Tim's life is otherwise worth living, um, maybe his parents love him. They treat him fairly well. He has fun playing with the other children. Like there are things about his life that make life worth living. Um, he doesn't really have a moral claim against his parents because he couldn't have existed otherwise. It's not like he can say my life is so abysmally awful that it's not worth living, because maybe there's things he enjoys, activities he likes hanging out with his friends. Maybe his parents are very loving, they treat him well otherwise. It's just something that couldn't be helped. There's this genetic flaw that caused this disability that makes Tim's movement more difficult. So that's sort of the case. We're going to think of Tiny Tim through the lenses of these principles that ground the non-identity problem. So let me move this little screen here. So let's start with component A, the person affecting view in ethics. This is roughly the idea that an action can be morally wrong only if it is bad for someone. It's weird to say that I did something wrong to a rock. Maybe I dropped a rock out of a window or something, and it bounced off a sidewalk and like rolled down a hill. It's weird to say that I did something wrong to the rock. It's not bad for the rock, because the rock doesn't really have any. I don't mean the rock, the actor / wrestler. The rock itself, the physical rock, it doesn't have moral interests. It doesn't suffer. It can't have its desires and projects and interests frustrated. It's not the sort of entity that morally matters or has moral standing, as bioethicists and philosophers would put this. There must be someone made worse by an action than they would otherwise have been for that action to be wrong. So this is sort of like a comparative counterfactual account. I've harmed you insofar as I've made you worse off than you would have otherwise been. If I rob you and I take your money, I've harmed you because in taking your money at gunpoint, I have made you worse off than you would otherwise have been had I not robbed you. That's the rough idea, and you can probably imagine some objections or challenges to that view. But broadly speaking, it's a pretty good rule of thumb for thinking about harm, pretty good heuristic or rough and ready rule. So if you accept A and you think about Tiny Tim's case through the prism of principle A, then Tiny Tim really lacks a moral challenge to his parents' actions. Given that his life is otherwise worth living, let's suppose even by his own account, he would acknowledge he likes playing with his friends, he's getting a good education, he's got loving parents. Overall, his life is worth living. It's just a little harder than everybody else's. He couldn't have been alive and not disabled. All right, so if you add those two components, you didn't make him worse off than you otherwise would have been, because he otherwise wouldn't have existed. And it's important to stress again, we're not talking about cases where someone is in excruciating pain or their life just isn't worth living and they don't want to exist. All right, we're talking about folks who, although their life is flawed, it's not perfect, but it's still worth living. There's still enough joy, happiness, and goodness in their life that overall it's worth living. So either he must exist with a disability or not exist at all, given the genetic nature of it. Right? It's just Tim came from a zygote, which became a fetus, which became a child, Tiny Tim. And it's not clear how you get Tiny Tim without that genetic disability. So either he doesn't exist at all, or he exists with a disability. You haven't made him worse off than he would otherwise be because there is no otherwise. Those are the only two options. Okay, so if you hold the component A, the person affecting you in ethics, then it looks like Tiny Tim doesn't really have a moral claim or a moral objection to his parents. There's not much they could have done otherwise, and there's no way that he would have been better off otherwise. He just wouldn't have existed. So he would have been deprived of a life that even he deems to be worth living. So that's just component A. What about component B? Well, bringing someone into existence whose life is worth living, though it has a major flaw. So in the case of Tiny Tim, he has weak legs, so he needs to use a crutch or a cane or something, isn't bad for the person. So bringing someone into existence with a flaw, whose life is otherwise worth living, doesn't harm that person. And the intuition here is similar to component A, all right, the last slide, which is, it appears to be Tiny Tim has a good enough life by his own standards. So we'll start with that. That's really important to keep emphasizing that point, because I've taught this before, and students will bring up cases where a baby is born as an excruciating pain, or it's constantly miserable, or there's just something like wrong with its respiratory system. There's just a really important sense in which the baby's life is not worth living. The child's life, it's just misery all the time, and it's the sort of life that nobody would really want to have. You know, it's just so gruesome and awful. Or maybe constantly having to go through surgeries and you're healing and in pain, and there's just not much about your life to look forward to that's redeeming. But that's not Tiny Tim's situation. His complaint that his life isn't perfect, which it's hardly good enough to condemn anyone's parents, because nobody's life is perfect. I mean, I'm sure all of us to some extent or another have things we've inherited from our parents that are genetic that we don't like. This isn't to say they rise to the level of being disability, they may not. But there's not a lot of options considering that's built into your genetic code. And we're talking about a situation in which we simply lack the technology to alter that genetic code. So bringing someone into existence who otherwise lives a life worth living, but that has a flaw, isn't bad for the person, because the alternative is to not exist at all. All right, so that's sort of I might light one up. That's the idea, and you can see why the similar intuition behind A is also going to kick in for B. That you're not doing something, it's not bad for the person to bring them into existence, even if they have a life worth living, even though there's a flaw like Tiny Tim's. Because once again, the alternative is non-existence, and presumably, even given his disability, Tiny Tim wants to continue living. He enjoys his life. Okay, so that leaves condition or principle C, which is the last one of the tri set that leads to the non-identity problem. Some acts of bringing into existence are wrong, even if it isn't bad for someone. Now, the intuition here is you might think, look, there's a sense in which you've made the world a worse place by giving birth or bringing Tiny Tim into existence. You now have a world in which there's somebody who is disabled and whose life is made a little bit worse because of that fact. So Tiny Tim, if we start out, you recall, Tiny Tim is charging his parents of doing something wrong. He doesn't like the fact that they brought him into existence with a disability. And the response from the parents was to say, well, it's either that or nothing, considering it's a genetic component of your being, and it's hard to see how you could exist without those genes. You can't really separate those out, and we lack the technology. But there's a sense in which Tiny Tim has a point. It's bad in the sense that you make the world a worse place because you've added someone to it that has a disability. Whereas if Tiny Tim didn't exist, it's a world in which there was one fewer person with a disability. So in that sense, even if it's not bad for Tim, Tiny Tim has a good life overall and prefers to live, there's bad that it isn't bad for someone, but there's some sense in which it's sort of wrong. Now, take climate change. So that seems a little harsh. I don't mean it to. I don't mean it to sound harsh at all. But take climate change as another example. you might think, look, there's a sense in which it doesn't matter whether we deal with climate change or not, because whoever it ends up affecting, a lot of the people who it affects wouldn't exist depending on what we did. So if we really mitigated climate change and really prevented it, and there's a lot of people who would be born who wouldn't otherwise be if we didn't prevent climate change. So some people just wouldn't have met and had children, like different people would have met and had children, and then you'd have a different population, depending on whether or not you mitigated climate change or not. So if you have a bunch of climate change refugees, people who are leaving their country because it's too hot, or there's not enough farmland, or enough food, or enough water, and so they leave to, like, maybe they go from like Africa to Europe or the Middle East to Russia, or you can imagine people just moving to getting away from the equator where it's really hot. So you can imagine these folks moving to get away from the effects of climate change, and in so doing, meeting people they would have never otherwise met, having children with them, creating a huge population of people who only existed because of this climate change immigration. Right, this migratory wave that is initiated by climate change. So you might think, in a sense, it doesn't really matter if you deal with climate change or not, because the people who are born and either preventing climate change or not would have existed otherwise. They don't really have a complaint against you insofar as their life is worth living, right? They wouldn't have existed otherwise. Their life's pretty much worth living, and either climate change is dealt with or it's not. Right? Different groups would exist. So either group, to the extent their life is worth living, doesn't really have a gripe. But you might think, yeah, that's true. But there's always almost something just wrong with not dealing with climate change. It's the sort of thing that you should deal with. It's not really bad for someone in particular to not deal with climate change, but there's also a sense in which it just seems wrong. I can't say who it's wrong for, right? So wrong even if it's not bad for someone. But there's a sense in which bringing people into the world where climate change is run amok, you've made the world a worse place in a sense. Now, you haven't necessarily made it worse for them because their alternative might be non-existence. And if they think their life is worth living, like maybe they immigrate to Europe and end up having a pretty good life. It's not that you've harmed them. It's that maybe you brought them up into a world in which you haven't fulfilled your duty. You haven't mitigated climate change. I mean, you as a society, like you just haven't done the job we should. So I'm trying to get you to see the tension here, that like there's this weird paradox between these three principles, and C is no different than A and B, and that there's like some intuitive appeal to it. If you explain it, really think about it, there's an intuition there. Even though you haven't harmed the people that were born in the midst of this climate change disaster, and I'm assuming it's not an existential threat, like it's bad, but people can live with it. There's a sense in which you've still done something wrong by bringing them into a world in which societies haven't really done their due diligence in dealing with climate change. And you can think about this in a number of ways. Like, maybe you haven't really harmed Tiny Tim by bringing him to existence, but maybe you didn't eat as well as you should have. As a parent, maybe your environment wasn't as healthy as it should have been. So by bringing Tim into existence, you've done something wrong because you brought him up in a world that you sort of neglected, even though you really haven't harmed Tim because he has a life worth living. And the alternative is non-existent. So I hope you can see how these components, these principles, A, B, and C, while each individually intuitive, clash. And that's the non-identity problem. How to think about our obligation to the future and our moral obligations to people in the future, given the actions we make, will have a bearing on who is even born to begin with. And at least in many cases, the folks being born may not have a legitimate moral complaint against us, but we may still have done something wrong. What do you think? Which would you throw out? A, B, or C? Or none? I'm curious what you think. Tell me in the discussion posts.